Reading with your kids.
Hola, ni hao, konnichiwa, assalamu alaikum, shalom, mahaba, moni muli wanji, namaste, jambo, bienvenidos. Hi, my name is Jedley, and this is the Reading with Your Kids podcast. We're coming to you from the beautiful neighborhood of Reedville in the southwest corner of Boston, Massachusetts. We're so delighted that you're joining us in our mission to help families grow closer through reading. Please be sure to subscribe to the show in the iHeartRadio app, on Spotify, Ghana, Himalaya, Amazon Music, Apple Podcasts, wherever you find your podcasts. Our guest today is Emily Barth Isler. She is here to celebrate her middle grade novel, Aftermath. Before we invite Emily into the studio, we want to let you know that this episode of the Reading with Your Kids podcast is brought to you by 14 Monkeys, a rainforest rhyme by Melissa Stewart. Melissa Stewart and Steve Jenkins have teamed up to bring you 14 Monkeys, a rainforest rhyme. It's a fascinating look at the 14 different species of monkeys living in Manu National Park in Peru. That's more than in any other rainforest on Earth. So how can so many species survive together in one place? Find out in this playful, rhyming picture book that explores how monkeys' sizes, habits, and diets help them live in harmony. 14 Monkeys received a starred review from Shelf Awareness and was a Reading Rainbow feature title, and it also won the California Eureka Book Award. Check it out today. Melissa Stewart, 14 Monkeys, a rainforest rhyme. Join us right now from the amazing city of Los Angeles in California. Our guest today is the author of a fantastic middle grade novel that Amy Schumer says is a gift to the culture. The name of the novel is Aftermath. Please welcome to the show, Emily Barth Isler. Hey, Emily, how are you?
Hi, Jed. Thanks so much for having me. I'm doing great. Thank you so much.
I'm excited to have you on. Boy, when you have somebody like Amy Schumer telling you that your book is a gift to the culture, that must have been pretty cool.
Oh, yeah, that is a incredibly wonderful endorsement. I feel so lucky. I've long been an admirer of Amy's, not just her stand-up and her comedy and her writing, but also her activism against gun violence. And so it was particularly meaningful to me to be able to send her the book and have her say such nice things about it and be able to share that with people. I think it goes a long way because her activism is really inspiring to me and to lots of people.
Yeah. So let's talk about Aftermath. What's this story all about?
Aftermath is the story of a 12-year-old girl named Lucy who moves to a new town with her parents after the loss of her younger brother, Theo, who died of a heart defect that he had his whole life. And they moved to this new town where a school shooting happened 4 years earlier. And Lucy is left to contend with her new 7th grade class, which is full of the kids who survived the school shooting. And she very much feels isolated and different from them because not only did she not was she not there when they all survived this incident together, but she decides not to share about the loss of her brother. She feels like her grief is really different from their grief and can't be compared. Lucy is a math whiz, so she thinks of everything in terms of equations and shapes and geometry and algebra, and feels very much like her grief is on a different plane than the kids that she's meeting at her new school. And also, it's hard to be the new kid. I mean, even without all of the circumstances that Lucy's facing, it's hard to be new in a town where everybody is very tight-knit and very close and, has been through something traumatic together. And so Lucy befriends a girl who's an outsider, sort of like herself, but she doesn't really know why. This girl, Avery, is also an outsider. And she has a really wonderful math teacher and takes a mime class after school that helps her learn how to communicate without words and without math and really open up. And it is a book, obviously, that deals with some heavy topics, but I hope and feel that it is ultimately uplifting and really about resilience and life after the news cameras go away.
I think people forget that, when a tragedy like a school shooting happens, that lingers in that community for a long, long time. Those kids, that community has been changed forever.
Exactly. I think there's so much emphasis, of course, as there should be, on the people who die, but there's not always a lot of emphasis on the people who survive and how it changes their life. I got the idea for the book following a shooting in 2015 that happened in San Bernardino, California. And I was really struck by the news coverage that was so hyper focused on the fact that there were a lot of survivors of this particular shooting, which of course is wonderful that lots of people survived. But the coverage was really overwhelmingly focused on the fact that these survivors could just, quote unquote, go back to their normal lives like nothing had happened. And I remember watching that and thinking, wow, that is asking too much of them. That is unfair to assume that just because somebody doesn't die in an incident that they're unscathed. And it made me think of all of the ways in which our society doesn't really have a way set up to support people who survive things, whether it's war veterans or cancer survivors or traumatic incident survivors, this way that we sort of assume that when somebody doesn't die, the alternative, it's very binary. It's like either you die or you're lucky and everything's fine. And of course, there's a whole spectrum in between of trauma and grief. And I am not a shooting survivor myself, but I am a survivor of a different kind of trauma and, spent a lot of time working on recovering from trauma and coming to terms with it, and felt a kinship to these survivors who were sort of expected by the media to just feel grateful that they survived, which of course I'm sure they are grateful. Mm-hmm. But like I said, there's a whole spectrum of survival and healing from trauma and survivor's guilt and, a myriad things that survivors need to grapple with. And I was really interested with what life looks like years later, mm-hmm. And also just really wanted to confront this epidemic. Of course, at the point when I wrote it, the Sandy Hook shooting was obviously still very large in my mind, as it always will be. And then over the course of writing and revising and submitting and trying to get the book published, there were dozens more school shootings. And each time it just felt more urgent and more relevant to talk about this, because my kids are younger, but even then, when my oldest was in kindergarten, we were all too aware of the fact that this could happen. The kids had active shooter drills a couple times a year in school. It was something that even my then 5-year-old was completely aware of. And I thought, gosh, we have got to find a way to start this conversation with kids so that they don't feel like it's this, absolutely terrifying. I mean, it is terrifying, but I wanted them to know that there are grownups out there who are working on it, who are passionate about ending this, who care. I wanted a conversation starter between parents and kids, between teachers and kids, for librarians, for any person working with children who definitely were going to have questions mm-hmm. about this horrible thing that we keep letting happen.
Yeah. It's interesting that you mentioned Sandy Hook. We recently had Scarlett Lewis, who's the mom of Jesse Lewis, here on the show. And I had a connection with Sandy Hook. I had performed in the town at the little Catholic school down the street from mm-hmm. Sandy Hook Elementary about a week or two before that horrific incident happened. And I returned to that school a year or maybe 2 years after that. And as I was walking into the school, when I'm bringing my equipment in for my educational magic shows, in addition to the magic, there's a sound system, and the speakers have to go up on these poles, and the poles are kept in a long black bag. And even though I had signed in at the office and gotten my tag and did everything right, when somebody saw me leaving my van carrying this
wow.
long black bag, they
Of course.
absolutely freaked out. So
Yes.
it lingers. Even people who are just associated, closely with it, it's
Yeah.
there.
I mean, I think that's what really gets me about this. And I've been a gun control activist for a longer time than even, long before I wrote this book. But what really strikes me is how our entire society is affected by these incidents. Of course, I never want to take away by the magnitude to which the really, the actual survivors, the people in the circle are affected. But I think it's sort of like a ripple effect. And a lot of us are affected tangentially. This entire generation of parents like myself have a fear about sending our kids to schools where horrible things like this can happen. An entire generation of kids goes through school, doing active shooter drills and very aware that these things happen at other schools. And, while we can hope that it doesn't happen directly to us or to our children or to someone we know, there are so many ways in which the entire country is affected every time something like this happens. And again, not to take away from, it's as my main character of Aftermath, Lucy, would say, it's base 10 versus base 1,000. There are levels and very different ways in which people are affected. But, there have been enough mass shootings in the past couple of years that felt so personal to me. And I realized they all feel personal to me. You don't have to be there. You don't have to know somebody, but there was one at the mall in the town where I grew up. There was one, the Annapolis Capital newspaper one. I grew up very close to there, and my dad and my grandfather were both reporters. And so that felt really personal. There was a shooting at a synagogue in Pittsburgh 3 years ago where my mom's family, was born and bar and bat mitzvahed and married. And that felt really personal. But I realized if those things feel personal to me, there are so many people affected and touched by these events and feeling helpless and terrified and sad. And, I really wanted to do something about it. And I thought, what is the way in which I could somehow start a conversation about this? And so this book really came out of that desire to make a difference and to help this movement that I feel really strongly about, in addition to, that I already was writing for children and love writing for children. This felt like a really beautiful confluence of those two interests.
Yeah. I'm really happy that you mentioned that you are hoping that this middle grade novel is going to start a conversation between parents and kids.
Yes.
We are huge advocates of families experiencing books together.
Yes, that's why I love your podcast. And I was so excited to talk to you because the idea of reading with your kids, this is not the book that you hand your 12-year-old and say, oh, go read this and see you later. This is a conversation book. This is a family book. I wrote it with not just kids in mind, but with parents in mind, with teachers. And so I really do hope it's read by families or classrooms or, adult and child combinations.
Yeah, it's so very important. And I think we oftentimes miss those opportunities. And I think, just as important as it is to talk to your little kids about what Mr. Bear is going to do next and helping our kids become empowered, these issues, they're important to teenagers. And I know myself, I wasn't really, when I was a teenager, I wasn't really up to start sharing my feelings and my deep felt feelings with everybody in my class. But I definitely would talk about them with my parents or with my grandmother. And so I think that's, when we co-read a book together with our teenagers and we take the time to talk to the kids about it on the way to school, on the way to ballet class, all those hours that you spend in the van together, instead of turning on the music that might, not feel comfortable for you to be there and listening to with your kid, or instead of handing them a device for them to get lost in, have that conversation about that really intense book that you're both reading.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that is the goal. That is the dream. And I certainly was fortunate to have that experience growing up. My family used to take long car rides, 10, 12 hours for family trips to visit relatives. And my parents would read to us long after my sister and I were both completely capable of reading to ourselves. We would read books out loud. And that feeling of family community, of sharing the same book, was so beautiful and intimate in a really lovely way, into my teens, probably through my teens. And the discussions that we had as a result over the books we read, and seeing my parents, be emotionally affected by things. Seeing them cry as we cried with a book. We read the entire Little House on a Prairie series and the Anne of Green Gables series, and tons of books that had their ups and downs. And it was really a chance for us all to experience a whole range of emotions together. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And of course, started lots of conversations that weren't necessarily directly related to the book, but it opened a lot of doors for us. Mm-hmm. And I saw then the power of reading a book communally as a family.
Yeah. You mentioned that you've been a gun advocate for a long time. And this is it's unfortunately, it's become a really divisive issue. And I don't think it has to be. I think we can all recognize that there's a problem.
Exactly. And I feel really strongly that it should not be controversial. I was sort of born into gun control advocacy. My grandfather was the editorial writer for the Washington Post for many, many years. And he wrote thousands, literally, of editorials about gun control following the assassination of JFK, and then into subsequent years. And he was actually instrumental in getting the first comprehensive gun control legislation passed by Lyndon B. Johnson. And, when my grandfather was working on it, it was called handgun control, because those were the kinds of guns people had available. And of course, they can do a lot of damage, and handguns are, just as dangerous. However, now we are dealing with, as we all know, machine guns with, just so much more capability for damage. And, it is a little bit I feel despair sometimes thinking about how far we haven't come in terms of that 50, 60 years ago, my grandfather was working on this thing and felt really passionate about it. And now we're not only dealing with that, now it's not just handguns, now it's machine guns. And so I actually never got the opportunity to meet my grandfather because he died before I was born. But I grew up reading his work. He left behind a legacy of what was important to him. I was able to read his work and know his heart and know what mattered to him. And that was really influential to me. And then my dad also became a reporter. And then I've also worked as a journalist and felt this sort of familial duty to, to use our words and our platform to do something good. And, writing this book was, I don't think I realized at the time I started writing it how much I felt connected to my grandfather in doing so. But I have seen firsthand how his words made a difference. And, that was certainly incredibly inspiring to me, whether consciously or unconsciously. And eventually, obviously, I sort of put it together and realized, oh, that's where I got this passion and this fire for this. I was just raised believing that there had to be some common sense laws the same way. And again, it's the way we regulate cars and drivers. I'm not saying that all guns should be banned. I'm, a big proponent just of regulation. There need to be some checks and balances, like there are for everything else, like there are for, medications that are addictive. I mean, there are some ways in which we as a society are not doing a great job with that one right now. But I think cars are probably the best comparable example. You register a car, you take a test, you take a class. You have to bring it in to be serviced. You have to prove that you're taking care of it. I think all those things could be true about guns. You should have to prove that you're storing them safely. You should have to take a class about how to keep other people safe. All of those things. It's not as scary as I think a lot of people believe. And it could save so many lives and so much trauma.
Yeah. Well, and I didn't grow up with guns at all, and I just come back from a tour of the Grand Canyon out in Arizona, and I was, to be honest with you, I was a little freaked out when I walked into the little desert grocery store / cafe / post office / courthouse, and everybody was walking around with a handgun on their belt. Because that's the culture, and I think it's more protection from snakes and things like that. But
right,
but we need to be able to sit down and admit to ourselves that it's not good that our kids are getting shot, and that there is an issue. So why can't we have a debate? It's not an either or. There's a debate, and sensible people can come to a consensus so that kids are safe, so that adults are safe, so that our community is safe.
Absolutely. And that's certainly part of the conversation that I hope gets started with this book. I mean, I hope that by the time the middle schoolers reading the book now are adults, that this problem has been solved. But if not, and gosh, I really, really hope we're not just doing this for another 20 years. But if we are, I hope that by the time these kids are adults and they get the opportunity to start voting, and getting involved in their local and state and national communities, I hope that it allows them to think critically about this issue and, make a change systemically. I think you have to start talking about those things young. Talking about gun violence to me is, it's like talking about sex. It's like talking about gender. It's like talking about drugs. It's all the things that we talk to our kids about. Also, because sadly, a huge section of the gun violence that we see in the United States is kids who get a hold of guns because they're not properly stored. And the safe storage movement is, it seems so crazy to me that it's at all controversial. There's been a movement to allow pediatricians to ask about how guns are stored in a house. And some people really have a problem with that. And that just seems so simple to me. It's one question. It's, like I said, if it were more regulated, like cars or anything like that, just to ensure that people are doing their best to keep kids safe. Mm-hmm. So I hope that this book has an impact on kids now that impacts, the future of how we as a culture think about guns.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, it's so important to have that conversation. And I'm so happy that you've created Aftermath to kind of facilitate and start those conversations. What else is going on in the life of Emily Barth Isler? Are there other projects that you're working on?
Yes. I've written a couple other books that I hope get to see the light of day soon. Some stuff in the works. And also my sort of other writing job is I work as a journalist writing about sustainable and ethically sourced beauty products, cosmetics, personal care. And that's something else I'm really passionate about, is sort of educating people about what goes on our bodies being as important as what goes in our bodies, and how our products are made and that kind of thing. It's a really fun thing to write about, and something I sort of started on a lark, maybe 12 or 13 years ago as a blog that has turned into a writing career, which is really fun.
That's wonderful. Hey, do you have any tips on any products that can help me sustain a head of hair? Because it's really bumming me out.
Well, a lot of that is just genetics and time, but there are some products out there. Sure. Yeah.
Well, I actually think it's too late for me now, but anyways, tell everybody where they can go to find out more about Aftermath and find out more about you.
Oh, thank you. I'm on Instagram and Twitter, both at Emily Barth Isler, all together, EmilYBarthisler. And from there, you can also find links to my website, which is the same, emilybarthisler.com, where I've got links about Aftermath and other nice things that people have said about it and all the reviews and stuff. I hope that I know adults find it to be a really daunting topic, but I've found so far that kids are so open and have questions and they want to talk about it. So I hope some of those reviews can make it less scary for the adults who are hesitant to start those conversations. I think kids really need it. They really want it. So
yeah.
I hope it helps.
Yeah. If I think a good rule of thumb is if you're concerned about it, if it's making you uncomfortable, then you really should be talking about it with your kids.
Exactly. And I'm so encouraged by how the kids of this generation, the ones I've talked to so far, the ones who've read the book so far, kids bring significantly less baggage to topics than adults do. Obviously, they have had less time on earth to think about it and to develop their own experiences and biases and memories. And there's a really beautiful way that kids see this stuff, and it gives me incredible hope for the future. And it's really a matter of getting adults to be comfortable talking about hard things, not just this one issue, and there are other issues that the book brings up that are hard to talk about too. And I think it's great. It's great practice. And I, as a parent, am always working on that too. Like you said, the things that make us uncomfortable are probably the things we should talk about more.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we've had a great time speaking to the author of Aftermath, Emily Barth Isler. Hey, Emily, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you, Jed. This is such a pleasure. I'm so delighted. I love your podcast, and I'm really happy to be here.
Please be sure to join us for the next episode of the Reading with Your Kids podcast. Our guest will be Keo McClare. She'll be here to celebrate her beautiful picture book. It's called The Big Bathhouse. You don't want to miss it. That's the next episode of the Reading with Your Kids podcast. If you're the author of a fantastic children's book, please do visit our website, readingwithyourkids.com. Click on the author's Click Here button at the top of the page and find out how we can help you let the world know about your fantastic children's book. You could be a guest on the Reading with Your Kids podcast. It's fun. It's easy. It gives you a chance to tell thousands of people about your fantastic book, and it doesn't cost you a thing. You can also submit your book to our Certified Great Read program, and if our panel believes that your book is worthy of 4 or 5 out of 5 stars, it becomes a Certified Great Read. And with that status comes a number of really powerful promotional tools that can help your book get noticed. And of course, you can take part in our monthly promotion program. We'll be letting the world know about your book through commercials on the podcast, blast to our 55,000 plus social media followers, and your book will be displayed on our national network of pedestrian billboards. Check it out today, readingwithyourkids.com. Click on the author's Click Here button at the top of the page and scroll on down to the various services. Want to thank the folks who made today's show so wonderful. Of course, I want to start by thanking our guest, Emily Barth Isler. Please be sure to check out Aftermath. Also want to thank our sponsor, Melissa Stewart. Be sure to check out 14 Monkeys, a really fun rhyming picture book. Also want to thank my team, Alejandro Doherty, Fatima Khan, Rory Brady, Michael Murphy. I want to thank my beautiful wife for all the support she gives me. Most of all, we all want to thank you. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. And as always, thank you so very much for taking the time to make the world a better place by reading with your kids. I'll be looking for you in the next edition of the Reading with Your Kids podcast.